other organisms face a multitude of threats in a world that is changing rapidly. Human development has encroached on the habitats of many plants and animals, and our presence has negatively impacted global biodiversity. More than 1,350 species of insects are currently vulnerable or endangered due to human development and intrusion into their habitats. By changing the landscape to meet our needs, humans have destroyed and severely limited many different habitats. Our industrial and agricultural development has encroached into the habitats of many insect species and contributed to the range expansion of invasive species. In this video, we will focus on how human-driven changes to insect habitats have contributed to the decline of insect diversity. The largest cause of insect population decline can be attributed to habitat loss and fragmentation, as industrial, agricultural, and other human development destroys many natural habitats that are rich in biodiversity. Forests are complex ecosystems that support rich species diversity. They also play a critical role in the regulation of water movement across a landscape and significantly regulate regional and local climates. Unfortunately, many forests around the world are removed by unregulated logging and by conversion of land for agriculture. Over 16 million square kilometers of forest have been lost worldwide in the past 50 years, an area almost as big as Russia. We know that habitat loss and habitat fragmentation can affect insect populations and insect diversity. Our next interviewee, John Spence, is one of the project leaders on a long-term experiment that evaluates different strategies for sustainable and economical boreal forest management. The project looks at the effects of different disturbances on the health of boreal forests over time. The project is called the Ecosystem Management Emulating Natural Disturbance Project, or the AMEND project.
The AMEND project grew out of a discussion, or flowed out of a discussion that was happening in Canada in the 1980s, when the scale of forestry on our landscapes became very evident to most of the Canadian public. Canada has always been prominent among the world's forestry nations, but when we realized how much forest was being eaten up by fiber demands, people got concerned. This prompted a national discussion. In the end, after a long national discussion, this ended up in the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers coming up with something that they called sustainable forest management. It was the term used around the world, but this is Canadian style, with a particular set of criteria to be able to say that you are managing your forest sustainably. So a couple of forest companies, Canfor and DMI, operating in northern Alberta, asked us to help them show that they were meeting those criteria, and that's where AMEND came from. AMEND is a very simple experiment in concept. We cross two main factors. One, fire, or a natural disturbance, because the boreal forest is thought to be driven primarily by fire. Various kinds of forest harvest and different strategies for cutting the forest. And we cross that then, those kinds of disturbances with different cover types in the boreal forest. And we chose to do 4 cover types that kind of represent the range of what we think of as boreal forest succession. So starting with the youngest successional stage, full mature forest, an aspen or deciduous forest, and ending up with a coniferous forest. There's been steady activity up there for 17 years or so. The experiment was designed with the idea that it would run for a full forest rotation. That's 70 to 90 years. I both hope and expect that I won't be alive to see the end of it, because it will mean that it's meeting those goals. It really depends on your question. If we're asking whether forestry can emulate natural disturbance, then of course the relevant control is the prescribed burns to find out whether or not the forest is recovering to the same state and at about the same rate as it does after wildfire. Essentially, all that we can. It depends to some extent on the interests of the people who choose to be involved in EMAND, but we've tried to monitor just about everything, a full range of taxes. So right now, we have something over, last I counted, I'm sure it's higher than that now because I know of one thesis alone which will contribute another 100 species or so. So but right now we have about 1,500, a little more than 1,500 spatially referenced species at EMAND. So, you know, all kinds of arthropods and insects, the full range of understory plants and mosses, trees, vertebrates to some extent, especially songbirds, and so on. So there's a pretty full range of biodiversity that's being investigated. The epigeic invertebrates, which will include carabid beetles, staphylinid beetles, and spiders, to a lesser extent ants, have been monitored right from the beginning and are regularly monitored as part of our periodic monitoring programs. We also try to do the night-flying Lepidoptera if we have people who are interested in doing that work, and we have some pretty good data sets about them. One that's particularly relevant at EMAND and in Canada, which is, I think, probably the most important one worldwide, is the elimination or changes in quality of dead wood. It is quite surprising. In fact, I think I'd have to say it was very surprising to me to begin to understand how much of a forest invertebrate fauna depends on dead and dying wood. A lot of it. That I think we've shown beyond a shadow of a doubt that variable retention forestry has a very useful application in the Canadian boreal. This was unknown before we started. With respect to biodiversity retention, no question that even 10% distributed residual on the landscape maintains biodiversity and increases its rate of recovery way past what happens after a clear cut. And I think anybody involved in the forest sector, either for profit or as a regulator or just because they're interested, will be interested in work done at EMAND. If I were to pick my favorite carabid, it would be one in the genus Anthea, which I'm hoping to collect in Africa in the next couple of weeks when we go there. These are beautiful beetles, big, black. They're called saber-toothed ground beetles. They're have very sharp jaws, and they're ferocious predators. They occur in the African savannas, some of them in boundary forests and so on. Incredibly beautiful and impressive beetles.
We also spoke with a forest health specialist with the Government of Alberta, Caroline Whitehouse, about important insects that impact our forests here in North America.
So my job title is Forest Health Specialist, and I work for the Government of Alberta. And the forest health group that I work with includes biologists and foresters, and together we're tasked with the detection and monitoring of forest health damage agents in the province. So this includes not just insects, but pathogens and abiotic damage, such as tree damage due to hail or wind blow events. All right, so we use several types of monitoring techniques for insects, and it just really depends on the level of the data that we're looking for. So to get a coarse view of the state of the forest on an annual basis, we perform aerial overview surveys. So this entails our field staff getting into helicopters or into small planes and flying transect lines across the forest. And so while they're doing this, they're sketch mapping forest damage and attributing it to specific damage agents using mapping software. And so then we're able to take this like course level data and compare it year to year for differences in the natural range of variation for the insects that we're seeing on the landscape. This information also is funneled to forest industry for their use when they're creating their annual harvest plans. So that's a course level view of the state of the forest. When we're looking for more population level data, we'll get on the ground and perform ground surveys. And finally, we do use some pheromone monitoring when we're looking at the finest scale. And so in the past, we have monitored spruce budworm populations using female sex pheromone-baited bucket traps. We also are keeping an eye on spruce beetle, and for that we use pheromone-baited Lindgren funnel traps to check for any changes in their relative abundances. So another poster child for climate-induced issues with regards to insects in our forest is mountain pine beetle. And so historically, Alberta has been a really inhospitable environment for mountain pine beetle, given how cold our winters have been. But with climate warming, we're now finding that mountain pine beetle is able to survive our winters a lot better and is now firmly established in the province. So the type of control measures that we would use for various insects really depends on the insect biology itself. And but first off, I should say that in Alberta, we actually don't control many insects, even when they're reaching outbreak levels, because we have a really high tolerance for damage in our forests. But one insect that we are actively controlling is mountain pine beetle, and it tends to be a cryptic feeder and spends most of its life under the bark, so feeding as a larvae or waiting out the winter in the late larval instar. So in this case, aerial applications of pesticides are really not as efficient as getting in there and actually treating each tree. So we cut and burn currently infested trees so that we can reduce the number of beetles that might be present for the next flight season. So the insects that would typically cause the most damage, I would say generally invasive species. And this would be because they arrive in this new environment without their natural enemies, which again are really important for keeping populations in check in their native habitats. And another factor is that so plants are able to co-evolve with their insect pests and develop defenses. And generally these plants in the new environment that the invasive species is encountering have not had that opportunity, and so are more vulnerable to the damage of the invasive species. So there are insects that are quite beneficial to forest health. And in particular, as a forest entomologist, I'd have to say that actually I think that most insects are beneficial for our forests. You particularly when you consider some that are pests in our environment. So you have defoliators, but while they're feeding, they're releasing nutrients to the forest floor. We have wood borers that are really important in helping decompose trees, which releases nutrients faster to the forest. And even, secondary bark beetles, such as those that preferentially attack weakened or senescing trees, help to speed up the regeneration of the forest. I sure do. And it's the elegant sheep moth. And so I find that moths are a little underappreciated in the insect world and sometimes by the general public, and that's because they fly at night, so they're less prominent. And the ones that people do see, they kind of seem to like creep them out a little bit with the way that they fly. And so the elegant sheep moth is this really pretty peachy, pinky colored diurnal moth that when, I'm able to tell people that this is this big, beautiful moth, because they typically would mistake it for a butterfly, they tend to kind of like come to admire moths a little bit more. So the elegant sheep moth is my favorite moth.
Grasslands have also been heavily degraded or lost in recent decades due to human activity, for purposes such as annual crop production or rangeland for domestic livestock. The conversion of grassland to crop production, typically to a monoculture, results in a landscape that supports much less insect diversity. Overgrazing by livestock also transforms grassland ecosystems. Overgrazing may create desert-like landscapes, which do not support as much biodiversity or biomass as lightly grazed grassland habitats. Such overuse affects grassland insect species, which in turn impacts soil fertility and plant growth. For example, herbivorous grassland insects help recycle nutrients back into the soil, and many pollinator species live and breed in grassland habitats. Indeed, many grassland pollinator species are threatened by agricultural development, such as the western bumblebee, which used to be one of the most common bee species in North America. Aquatic ecosystems are also affected by human development. For instance, construction of canals and reservoirs can influence groundwater saturation in a region. This affects soil characteristics that in turn determine regional floral diversity and the insect community that depends on those plants. The manipulation of natural water bodies on a landscape can interrupt natural water flow cycles, as well as water temperature and sediment load, which disturbs the development and survival of aquatic insects. For example, the construction of dams can severely impact aquatic insect species, often reducing biodiversity downstream of the dam. Changes in ecosystem structure can lead to alterations in the local assemblage of insects and other organisms, especially if many species are unable to tolerate or adapt to the changes. Habitat fragmentation is a good example of a change in ecosystem structure that can impact insect populations. Habitat fragmentation is defined as the process by which continuous habitats are broken into numerous smaller patches. This process can result from natural or human-induced factors and often reduces the available habitat for organisms. In addition, habitat fragmentation can result in the physical isolation of populations. Such separation of small populations can lead to a phenomenon known as inbreeding depression, in which populations become highly inbred to the point that the health of individuals drastically declines. Isolation of particularly small populations can also result in an inability of the insects to locate each other and mate. This can lead to a drastic decline or even a complete crash of a population. Habitat fragmentation is mainly caused by two human-driven disturbance factors: agricultural development and urbanization. The booming global human population has led to an increase in the demand for food, and naturally, the amount of land that is devoted to agriculture to produce that food. This has resulted in highly modified landscapes, often composed primarily of monocultures. This artificially homogeneous landscape is completely different from the original habitat. It is not surprising, therefore, that populations of insects that are unable to adapt to these changing landscapes can go locally extinct. This situation may be even more dire for insect species that either have low dispersal capabilities, like small-bodied insects, or specialized habitat requirements, such as monophagous species or aquatic insects. These insects are unlikely to be able to colonize new habitats, and as a result can become isolated from other distant populations. This can lead to inbreeding depression and ultimately extinction. Many parasitoids, for example, are short-range dispersers. Clearings created by humans between fragmented forests can act as a barrier to the movement of parasitoids whose hosts feed on the trees. One study found that dipteran parasitoids of forest ant caterpillars avoid clearings and forest edges, resulting in lower rates of parasitism in fragmented forests compared to continuous forests. This may be one explanation for why forest ant caterpillar outbreaks last longer in fragmented than intact forests, since the ability of parasitoids to respond to the presence of their hosts is affected by the landscape. Overall, intensively farmed monocultures support much less diversity than systems with multiple species present. As land is converted for intensive agricultural use, there are fewer areas of natural habitat to support insect populations, and natural habitats become fragmented as they are divided by land conversion. Agriculture, however, is not the only development that has drastically changed the landscape. Fragmentation can also occur from industrial practices, such as the formation of survey or seismic lines. This practice removes long strips through forest landscapes for industrial surveying and results in fragmentation of forest habitats. Although the individual lines may be narrow enough to produce only small-scale fragmentation, the great abundance of survey lines that are typically created can result in fragmentation over a much larger landscape level. Habitat modification and fragmentation also occurs with another human-driven practice, urbanization. Urbanization is the process by which people move from rural areas into towns and cities that results in the growth of these urban areas. It is a high-impact global phenomenon characterized by high human population densities. As the populations of cities and towns grow, the footprint of urban centers sprawl across the landscape and wild habitats are lost. This modifies the landscape and, like extensive agricultural development, can affect the survival and dispersal of insect populations. For example, roads can fragment natural habitats. Furthermore, roads can inhibit insect movement through the habitat because insects crossing an open road may be more exposed to predators compared to those hiding in the vegetation. The impact of urban roads and buildings can extend beyond the boundaries of the structures themselves. For instance, vehicle emissions like carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, volatile organic compounds, and even rubber or road salt can influence insect habitats. Similarly, heat from urban buildings warmed by the sun often radiates into the surrounding landscape, resulting in warmer than normal habitat conditions. As ectotherms, all insects are sensitive to heat, so species that are already near their thermal maximum don't do well in such conditions. Light pollution, a common phenomenon across the globe, can also impact insects since much of their life history is dependent on a circadian rhythm, a biological clock that dictates their behavior. Diurnal insects exposed to extensive light pollution at night may have interrupted rest cycles, which can lead to altered reproductive cycles because of the unnatural lighting. Nocturnal insects, on the other hand, can be fooled into orienting to nearby light sources. This can result in lost time and energy spent in movement towards an artificial light source. This causes the displacement of nocturnal insects away from their natural habitat to an area where they are concentrated and easy targets for predators. Light sources can also kill the insects attracted to them when the insects make contact with the hot glass. Other nocturnal insects may be repelled by light sources, excluding them from a habitat which they might otherwise populate. This makes light pollution a form of habitat loss. Dung beetles are one group of insects that can be severely impacted by urban development because they use the stars and the light of the Milky Way to navigate. After finding a dung pile, the beetles will form the dung into a ball and roll it directly away from the pile to avoid competitors. They use light from the stars in the night sky to navigate and direct this movement. A study done in a planetarium in South Africa showed that when the stars and Milky Way were no longer visible in the sky, as would occur with light pollution, dung beetles lost the ability to navigate and scattered chaotically from the dung source. In an urban environment, there is typically less biodiversity toward the center of a city, likely due to the limited plant life in the middle of most cities. Urban parks and large gardens can provide refuge for some insect species, a topic that we will cover in a later video. Some insects have begun to adapt to the changed environments of urban centers. For instance, in urban areas with significant light pollution, some nocturnal moths orient less frequently to lights than moths from dark areas. This reduces their mortality both from the hot light sources and from predators, and results in less time wasted orienting to artificial lights. The moths of the studied urban areas demonstrate an evolutionary response to human environments. Insects are highly adaptable animals and may be able to evolve in response to many of the changes made by humans. Human activities have led to habitat loss around the world. Habitat loss and fragmentation are powerful drivers of local extinction of some insect species and can alter insect species' presence, abundance, and diversity. Our next topic of discussion will focus on the impacts of another challenge faced by insect populations: climate change.